This year, TYT's been making a lot of moves. Now you can too. Now, how are you going to do that? You want to launch a new business? That sounds fun. You're going to change careers? Geez, Lord mercy. You're going to need a website for all that. Lucky for you, Squarespace also making moves. You're going to go to squarespace.com/TYT. You're going to get 10% off your first purchase, and you're going to get to build anything you want on that website with a unique domain. What are you, crazy? Go do it now. Go. Welcome to TYT Interviews. We're going to do a unique one today. We are going to have someone else from the TYT network on to discuss one issue in particular, and that is Russia. Dun, 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 dun. So if you remember, you're watching this live. Everybody else, it'll go up for you soon, and you'll get to watch it for yourself as well. But this is when you would be watching it because you're not watching it live. Okay, anyway, we go to Kyle Kulinski from Secular Talk, and he's going to join us on this issue. I brought Kyle on because he's a reasonable dude. I fancy myself a reasonable dude. And we ostensibly have a disagreement on Russia. I think it's a big deal. I'm going to characterize his position as not a big deal. But luckily he's here and can speak for himself. And what we're going to try to do first is find points of agreement, which I suspect will be plentiful, and then boil down to our disagreement on Russia, and then figure out why we each have the position that we do. So, Kyle, first, can I get you to agree that that was an excellent Super Bowl?
Yes, although I do have to add the caveat that I'm one of about 17 guys in America that doesn't care at all about football.
Okay, I think that I rest my case, and I will see all of you guys later. All right, score one for me as we move forward. All right, no, seriously, and I want to be clear, this is just a discussion. So now, I will say that I think that Russia is a quote-unquote big deal because I believe that Trump did far worse than helping the Russians meddle in our elections. I believe that he did money laundering, and I think that he owes the Russians and is paying them back, and I think it is a wildly dangerous situation for our democracy. Okay, so what part of that, if any, do you agree with, and what part do you disagree with?
So I agree that Trump probably did money laundering. I think he did money laundering not just with Russia. I'm convinced he did it with other actors as well. I think he's colluded with other governments, perhaps in an even more clear way than he's colluded with the Russian government, if he's indeed colluded with the Russian government at all. You know, when we talk about this issue of RussiaGate, I think it's actually a very complicated issue because there's many different moving parts to it. So the first question is, and you just touched on it, what is Trump guilty of? I would say that he's probably guilty of money laundering. I think he's guilty of collusion with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And I also think he's guilty of other financial crimes with, there's evidence he's done it with the mafia. There's evidence he's done it with big banks and Wall Street firms. So generally speaking, I'd say I support what Robert Mueller's doing, but I support what Robert Mueller's doing because I think he can basically take out one by one Trump's cabinet on crimes like that. So, for example, what he's already done with Flynn, what he's already done with Manafort, like I support that stuff, and there's a lot of evidence of the guilt of various actors in Trump's administration. But I just think that the idea of Trump being Putin's puppet or Trump doing treason is basically a liberal pipe dream that's equivalent to Democratic Benghazi. Because you're never going to get Trump on treason. You're never going to get Trump on being Putin's puppet. Nor do I actually think he is those things. So I think that's the crux of our disagreement.
All right. So now let me agree back with you first on a couple of issues. I think that it is curious that we don't talk about Donald Trump's collusion with Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and some of the other countries that you mentioned. Now, I get why, because there is no allegations that Saudi Arabia mess with the vote. On the other hand, Donald Trump has very clear financial interests in Saudi Arabia and seems to have changed our policy to suit Saudi Arabia, which is deeply problematic. And an argument could be made for Israel and certainly Turkey as well. So does the media care less about that because Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Israel, et cetera, are ostensibly our allies, and it's uncomfortable to talk about that? And are they demagoguing Russia because it's easier? Yes. So I agree with you on that. And is the Democratic Party using Russia meddling in the elections as an excuse for their loss to Donald Trump? Yes, I agree with you on that. No question about that. Now, and I think there was a lot of different factors involved. Now, but if you think that Donald Trump has done the money laundering, as I do, and apparently you do to some extent, isn't that kind of a big deal to paraphrase Biden?
No, absolutely. I think it is. I think all the financial stuff that you can get him on, of course it's a big deal. It's a big deal in the same way that, people like us went after Hillary Clinton for the Clinton Foundation and the fact that she took a tremendous amount of money from Saudi Arabia and all these very repressive governments, and then she did their bidding and helped them through policy. By the same token, when you look at what Trump's done, just to give people the specifics, Cenk, because I'm not sure that I'm not sure people know a lot about the Saudi Arabia thing or the Turkey thing or the Israel thing, because again, the media doesn't discuss it. But, in those instances, like Trump registered 8 new businesses in Saudi Arabia when he was on the campaign trail. He also took $270,000 from top Saudi officials for them to stay at his hotel, not because they actually needed to spend $270,000. That was a bribe. And they were paid back because Trump gave them a $350 billion weapons deal. And then, by the way, they took those weapons and turned around and they're literally committing a genocide in Yemen right now. And I don't use that word lightly. I think that's the right word to use for what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen with the weapons that we gave them. So I think there's a clear connection there. And I would love it if Mueller gets him on anything. I think it'd be great. But I think the thing that frustrates me is they're focusing on the flimsier case, the case of Russia. And the reason why they're doing that is because there are hawkish goals here. And these are the same hawkish goals that have been in place for a very long time. I'm going to use the dirty word here, but the deep state has always been standoffish against Russia. We've expanded NATO towards their border when we promised that we wouldn't do that. And now, because we're so obsessed with Trump's connection with Russia, you find a lot of overtly hawkish rhetoric coming from Democrats. And I know that they view it as like they're resisting Trump and they're being strong on Trump. But the reality is, when you have Rachel Maddow, for example, arguing that if Trump removes NATO troops from Russia's border, that somehow proves that Putin has the pee-pee tape and therefore he's Putin's puppet, and therefore Donald Trump should keep NATO troops on Russia's border. I don't agree with that. And in fact, I think that's Rachel Maddow being like very neocon, hawkish, and flirting with World War III because of how she's choosing to resist Trump on the Russia issue. So if they wanted to resist Trump just on the financial crimes angle, we wouldn't even be having this conversation, because I'm totally on board with that. In fact, I think I'm even stronger on that issue because I could point out the 1,000 ways he's done the corrupt deals and he's done the collusion with other foreign governments. I mean, to give the example of Turkey, Michael Flynn took $500,000 from the Turkish government. Then Michael Flynn pushes the U.S. government to not arm the Kurds who were fighting ISIS. So that's direct money from the Turkish government, and then we did something directly to benefit the Turkish government. There's your collusion right there. That's been proven, but nobody talks about it. Nobody cares, because that's not the real concern of the people who are yelping about this. The real concern is, let's move to the right on foreign policy and let's be hawkish and escalate with Russia.
So, let alone Flynn's deal where they were planning to kidnap someone from America and deliver him to Erdogan, which is just insanity. Yeah. Now, look, people will say, and rightfully so, that's Flynn. We don't have any evidence, nor do I even suspect that Trump authorized that. Now, Trump does have business dealings in Turkey, so I wouldn't put it past him and be happy to do that investigation, but there isn't very much evidence of that. But there's overwhelming evidence against Flynn and hence the plea deal that he took. Now, on the hawkishness, look, I don't want to be hawkish towards Russia. I also don't want to be naive towards Russia. I don't think that they have our best interests. Sometimes I see progressives who are like, oh my God, no, Putin and Russia could be our allies. Putin is basically a dictator. And if you're a progressive, you should have no interest in defending Vladimir Putin, who has been against democracy in Russia, let alone Ukraine and other places. So this whole thing of like, no, poor Putin has been, put upon by the West. I'm not buying that. I'm not interested in dictators anywhere, including Russia. But just because I don't want to be hawkish towards Russia doesn't mean that we should not investigate things that Trump might have done with Russia. I think that I could have the position of, no, I don't wish to go to war with Russia, and I also don't wish to let them get away with whatever deal that they have with our president. That makes sense?
Absolutely. If that was where it ended, again, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I think the problem is the consequences, not just from the position that you're taking right now, but the effects that this has had on the broader political scene. So, just to give a few examples, Democrats are now in favor of arming rebels in Ukraine. And those rebels are very unsavory characters, including there's been some reporting on how there are neo-Nazi rebels in Ukraine who are anti-Russia. And so the idea is, well, you arm them and you have a standoff over the Crimea thing. So that's not, again, you can be, like, I wouldn't say I'm anywhere near pro-Putin. Of course, I agree with you. He's an authoritarian menace, but he's a threat to his own people. And I don't think
that people of Ukraine and the people of Georgia and potentially people of Estonia.
Okay, so then this gets into a bigger issue then. What exactly should our policies be towards Russia on that front? And, I've tried to make clear to my audience all along, every time I talk about this issue, where I stand on those policy issues. So, for example, the Exxon deal. I'm against the Exxon deal. I think if Trump ends up approving that, yes, that's sign of corruption and cutting a deal. But I'm for the sanctions over Crimea, tentatively, because again, you have to take into account NATO's history of expanding towards Russia's border, which they view as aggression. But I'm not in favor of, for example, the sanctions, the new round of sanctions over the so-called election meddling. Because number one, the intelligence agencies presented zero evidence for that. And these are the same people who said that Saddam did 9/11, and so we need to do the Iraq war. And number two, we're acting like there are no consequences. We keep escalating with them and keep hitting them with sanctions on top of sanctions on top of sanctions, arming rebels that are on their border. And then we expect he's just going to fall back in his place. No, he's a nuclear armed power. And this is why this is a dangerous game that we're playing.
Yeah. So look, if you say to me, I don't want to get into a dangerous game with Russia and arming unsavory characters in Ukraine, I'm going to agree with you, mainly because whenever we go to arm unsavory characters, we don't have a great track record on that. I remember a guy we armed back in Afghanistan that was fighting the Russians at the time. His name was Osama bin Laden. Oops.
Right. That's right.
So I'm against that kind of interventionism. On the other hand, Estonia is now, whether it was right to do in the first place or not, is part of NATO. So if Russia goes into Estonia, it's incredibly important that we protect Estonia. Otherwise, our treaties don't mean anything.
So then you would potentially do World War III to protect Estonia?
Then I told you lose me on that. World War III is really hyperbolic, super hyperbolic. So whenever, sometimes some folks on the left, you get into a situation of what should we do about Russia, sanctions, not sanctions, etc. Boom, World War III card, right?
Well,
so you can do things
further
about his incursion into Georgia, Ukraine, and Estonia short of launching nukes.
Well, right, but again, if we're what we're doing right now is we have a NATO buildup on his border, and that's like if Russian troops all of a sudden were right on the border of Mexico. Every single politician in the U.S. would say, "Get the guns ready. It's time to fight back." But for some reason, when we put NATO troops directly on his border, that's viewed as like, "Oh my God, if you're against that, you're a Putin puppet." And that's
no, I don't think you're a Putin puppet. I don't think anybody's a Putin puppet in that regard. But if you say, hey, maybe we should have Estonia, Latvia, et cetera, withdraw from NATO, that's an interesting argument. But it's a different thing to not defend Estonia if they are part of NATO.
Well, let me just say, I'll just go on the record now and say I would not send U.S. troops to fight to protect Estonia. And you could say that means I'm weak on Russia or whatever the case is. Sorry, but I don't think, yes, potentially risking, I'm not saying it would lead to World War III, but if we get into some sort of a hot war over Estonia, I don't think it's worth it to send, men and women from Kentucky who never heard of Estonia until 3.5 minutes ago to maybe fight and die to protect them. And again, this all goes really back to the issue of NATO and who's really at fault here. Like, again, I said I'm tentatively for the sanctions on over the Crimea thing. And the reason I say that is because we lied to Russia. When the Soviet Union was broken up, we said, listen, we're not going to move an inch towards your border. And then we kept moving towards their border. That's a provocative action. That's an aggressive action. And that's not something we would tolerate from them. Look at what happened when they put missiles in Cuba and pointed them at us. We said, oh, shit, we're going to war. So the fact that we have them in that position right now, again, I'm just trying to get people to see this from both sides. And that doesn't mean that Putin's a good guy. He's a menace against his own people. But I don't think he's a threat in the same way that people are being hyperbolic and acting like, he's going to lead to the fall of Europe. I don't agree with that.
Yeah. So now let's let me just finish that topic and move on to other stuff that's more relevant. So
Sure.
in terms of like encroaching into Russia, it's a super fair point that if they were had troops in Mexico or Cuba, for example, that we would lose it, and we have. That's a fact. And that Estonia is an Estonia throw away from Russia. I get all that. And maybe we shouldn't have brought NATO that close to Russia. We have a disagreement on we have that treaty. We do. And if you let him take Estonia, then he can take whatever country he wants. Now, luckily, he hasn't done that yet. Okay, so and I wouldn't want to signal to him that it might be okay to do that because look at what happened in the first Persian Gulf War. But that's okay. I get it. People get both sides. Now let's go to the heart of the issue.
Sure.
So when you talk about no evidence, I don't agree at all. Let's figure out what we mean by that. So first of all, there's a recent story that just came out about the Dutch media had insiders from Dutch intelligence saying they tapped into Russia's hacking. So they hacked the Russians while the Russians were hacking us. And not only did they see in their computers that they were hacking the U.S. State Department, the Democratic Party, the White House even, and they told our intelligence officials that, but they actually tapped into the cameras and saw the Russians doing it with their own eyes. So
the Russians doing what?
Or the Russians hacking in to all the things that I mentioned, State Department, Democratic Party, etc. This is pre-Podesta emails. Okay.
So Russian government was hacking our government, basically.
Yes, the Russian intelligence officials that were in a university campus near Red Square that was doing it. So that's evidence.
Well, sure, but we're doing the exact same thing to them.
Yes.
There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
Okay.
So should everybody sanction us because we do it to them? I mean,
if they could prove it, yeah, they should. We meddle in people's elections all the time. It's outrageous, wildly counterproductive, and has been fairly disastrous, not only for the rest of the world, but for us. I mean, look at all the coups we did. I mean, you want to talk about meddling? We killed four democratically elected leaders in foreign countries. We did coups against guys like Mossadegh in Iran, and then wondered why they hate us. So if you say for us to not meddle in other elections, I love it, brother. Totally agree. But that doesn't mean we should let the Russians do it to us either.
So let me ask you then, what do you think the punishment should be for them in this instance?
World War III. No. Look, see, then you get into a super interesting conversation because you got to break it down, right? So there is meddling in our election, and we have to break that further down. What does that mean exactly, right? And then there is the money laundering that we talked about. So let's do it one at a time. When you talk about meddling, okay, so if the heaviest charge the Democrats have, and I think when they started, this was their heaviest charge, because they're actually not that bright, and they didn't even have any idea how corrupt Donald Trump actually is, right? And their main charge was they stole Podesta's emails and DNC emails, and that's the biggest crime in American political history. No, I think that's small potatoes. And
Well, I'll go a step further. I'm in favor of that. I wanted to see those WikiLeaks emails where, look, that's this. I view that this exact same as I view like the Snowden Greenwald leaks. Like here's the information about how the NSA is spying on everybody. Oh, well, thank you very much for the public service of releasing that. That should not have been a thing that the public doesn't get to see. By the same token, if one party's rigging a primary, yeah, I want to see it. I don't care who the source is or how we got it. I'm still happy that we saw it.
so I'm only halfway towards you because on the one hand, I want to see the Pentagon Papers. I want to see what Snowden released and Manning released, and it helps inform us in our so-called democracy, such as it is, right? And so I'm in favor of that. People keep talking about, oh my God, WikiLeaks, they had it. Yeah, if the New York Times had it, they'd publish it, and they did, right? So I don't see any issue with that at all. So I'm not trying to punish WikiLeaks. I'm not trying to punish anyone who published it. I think it was super useful information, and we covered it on the show a lot, for which we got tremendous heat from the Democratic establishment. But it's one thing if that happens. It's another thing, though, if a foreign government, whether it's Russia, China, or Saudi Arabia, goes, I got the emails of the Republicans and the Democrats, but I think the Republicans are going to help me and the Democrats are going to hurt my interest. So I'll only release the Democratic ones, and so I tricked you into voting for the guy who's actually going to do what I want. That's problematic.
Sure. Now, so what I would say to that is, number one, of course, I'm in favor of seeing whatever dirt the Republicans have, too. I'm consistent in my approval of leaks. But number two, what are the consequences of, so let's assume that's true for a second. What are the consequences of that? So Putin preferred Trump, but why would he prefer Trump? Well, one of the reasons was Putin is backing Assad in Syria. That's his ally. Trump had said repeatedly on the campaign trail, look, I'm not going to get involved in Syria. Let's let Vladimir Putin handle ISIS, and let's leave the Assad government alone. Now, I hate to be contrarian here, but I totally agree with them on that point. Now, unfortunately, Trump didn't actually follow through with that, which gets to the point of, I think, the evidence being flimsy overall for some sort of a deal between the Russian government and Trump, or Putin and Trump, because so at the end of the day, what can you point to where you say, oh, no, he definitely did a deal with them? You could point to, for example, oh, he didn't implement the sanctions over the election meddling. But
yeah, that's kind of a big deal.
Well, but then that's only 1/5 of the picture because, for example, Trump did just 3 days before that story came out, Cenk, on that Friday, CNN had an article about how they just implemented a new round of sanctions over Crimea. So, okay, he doesn't do one set of sanctions, but he does a different set of sanctions. Then, like I said, he armed Ukrainian rebels who are anti-Russia. So it's a weird thing to do if you're that guy's puppet, to arm the people who are fighting him. Then he bombed the Syrian government. That happened a few months ago. And then they also recently, the State Department announced this: we're staying in Syria indefinitely. That was a huge story to me, but it got next to no coverage in the media because, again, that's one of those stories where if you cover that, the only logical takeaway is, well, he's definitely not acting like Putin's puppet if he wants to permanently militarily occupy the nation to be against the government that is Putin's ally. That's a weird way to be a puppet to somebody. And then, like I brought up before, he kept NATO troops on Russia's doorstep. They're there right now. And he didn't approve the Exxon oil deal. So, yes, I grant you that, okay, he didn't implement the sanctions over the so-called election meddling. That's one policy that can be viewed as pro-Putin. But I just gave you 5 others that are massively anti-Putin. And this goes back to the point I made at the beginning, why the Saudi Arabia issue is bigger to me and the Israel issue is bigger to me. We haven't even discussed the Israel one in detail, because if you do a deal with those governments, the downsides are actually worse. So the downside of a Saudi deal is we just gave a theocratic dictatorship $350 billion worth of weapons, and they're bombing women and children in Yemen. The consequences of a deal with Israel is Jared Kushner, for example, took a lot of money from Israeli banks. And in turn, the Israeli government called the Trump administration when he was president-elect, and they got them to fight back against the UN. They said, call all the countries you have connections with at the UN and try to get them to be against the resolution condemning the illegal settlements. So that's collusion where they're doing something in favor of a government, and I think it's way more damaging than, for example, if he did Putin's bidding and stayed out of Syria. In fact, I would have liked it if they stayed out of Syria.
So, look, the fact that you might like a couple of those positions, whether they were derived from collusion or not, and as part of a deal with Trump or not, to me is immaterial. Yeah,
Sure.
I don't want to do bombing in Syria either, but if I find out it was because Trump, not out of the goodness of his heart or because he had the correct policy position, did it because of what he owed the Russians, I'm going to have an issue with that.
Sure, on principle, sure, you could do that.
Yeah, and come on, look at the way that he did the Syrian bombing. Oh, golly gee, I am going to bomb those dastardly Syrians. I will bomb an airway that they are not, a runway that they are not using. I will bomb old planes that they are not using. The new planes are in the hangar where I know exactly where they are, but I will not bomb them. But look at me getting tough on Russia.
Well, why stay there indefinitely then?
Okay, so that's point number 2. Great question. So Donald Trump is, not, thank God, not the dictator. There are a lot of things he wants to do, and he keeps getting blocked. Everybody knows that he didn't want to do the sanctions on Russia. They passed it 98-2 in the Senate, overwhelmingly in the House, and he signed it, even though he said, I don't want to sign it. He had to sign it. And then there is, yes, 4-cent play. You can call him deep state. You can call him mid-state. You can call him whatever you like, right?
Or hawkish on Russia.
All state. They're all in favor of hawkishness everywhere, and including on Russia. So they put a ton of pressure to, hey, Mr. President, you got to stay in there. And the knucklehead from time to time goes, oh, yeah, okay, who was the last guy in the building? Okay, that guy? All right, fine. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now John Kelly's his chief of staff, and he's largely driving policy. Now, when you, on the issue of the sanctions, one of the things that they, quote unquote, implemented was they came up with a list of Russian oligarchs and then said, okay, here's the list because you made us do it because it's in this goddamn bill that we didn't want to sign. What are we going to do about it? Oh, nothing. We're not going to freeze their assets. We're not going to do anything. It's just a list. Okay, are you happy now? So, no, the main thing is the sanctions. And I said that he would not impose those. Then he was forced to sign it. And then he refused to impose them anyway, even though it's his legal obligation to do so. Gee, I wonder why he did that.
But again,
do you think, Kyle, it's because that he has a ideology that he thinks on political philosophy?
Of course
that
I don't.
Right.
Of course I don't. But here's the thing. I don't care. If he somehow stumbles upon the right policy for the wrong reasons, fine. Now, I hear you that, like, okay, you could object to that on principle and say, well, Mueller should still do his thing. And I say, I agree with you on that. But at the end of the day, I find it hard for me to get mad if he stumbles on doing policies that I agree with. So, for example, let's just say, for argument's sake, it was because of collusion that he decided we're not going to go into Syria at all. We're going to stay totally out. I would say, well, that's good. I'm happy that we're staying out of Syria. And even if it was a horrible way in which we got to that conclusion, it's just hard for me to get angry if, like, he stumbles upon doing the proper policy. But then this gets to a deeper question, which is, what's the end game? Because, again, I agree. I like that Mueller's taking out his cabinet one by one, Flynn, Manafort on financial crimes and money laundering. And in fact, I think my case is bolstered by what Steve Bannon said, because Steve Bannon said, no, you're not going to. They buried the lead in an article from a few weeks ago. And basically, Steve Bannon said, it's money laundering, stupid. That's what he argued. So in other words, all the headlines were like, Bannon calls meeting with Russian nobody treasonous. But then you read the article, and in like paragraph 6, they're like, Bannon's like, no, it's the money laundering. They're going to get him on the money laundering. Which, okay, good. That's good. That's great. But, and this is, I think, another part of my frustration on this issue with the Democrats is, Cenk, there is no end game here. Because let's say you knock out all of Trump's cabinet. Great. Knock out all of them. Kushner, Ivanka, whoever. I don't care. Knock them all out. Then you're left with Donald Trump. And what are you going to have? The overwhelming majority Republican Congress impeach him? And then even if you do that, you wake up the next day, you get Mike Pence, who's just as bad, if not maybe worse, because he's actually sly and clever, and he's a true fundamentalist Christian Kool-Aid drinker and a believer in, trickle-down economics and all that stuff. He's Donald Trump, who sounds slightly more intelligent with a smirk and a true belief in Christian fundamentalism. So
Kyle, look, there's
let me just real quick. Let me just say one more thing real quick, which is I think this issue allows the Democrats to resist without resisting, because every second they're sucking the air out of the room by going on and on, Russia, 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 Russia. That's a second they're not talking about Medicare for all or free college or a living wage or ending the wars or a New Deal or any of the things that are actually going to get them to win an election. And I was going to save this for later, but I'll just bring it up now. There was an article in The Hill in June, and this is from a poll that they did. Listen to this, Cenk. A majority of voters, I'm quoting from the article, a majority of voters are against the Russia investigations and are eager to see Congress shift its focus to healthcare, terrorism, national security, the economy, and jobs. Those are the findings of the latest Harvard-Harris poll survey. 64% of voters said the investigations into President Trump and Russia are hurting the country. So, in other words, my point is, even if you're right about all of this, it's still terrible politics, and it's turning into Democrat Benghazi. Even if you say there's a there, it's turning into Democrat Benghazi, and it's going to lose the Democrats an election.
All right, good. There's plenty for me to disagree there, but also plenty for me to agree on. So let's get going on that. So first of all, when you say this is resisting without resisting, absolutely right. Totally agree. So it's an excuse not to talk about policy issues because their donors don't want them to talk about policy. Talking about Russia is easy. It's an easy way out. It doesn't cost their donors a dime, right? In fact, it might make defense contractors more money. So totally agree on that. And they're using it as an excuse. But Kyle, I have an issue with sometimes it appears that what you're saying is, well, I like the policy position he's winding up at, so whatever, right? No, I mean, I might like a couple of those policy positions he winds up at, but I care deeply that how he got there, because that affects the next set of elections and the next set of elections, and whether we have a guy who is controlled by a foreign government. That is super important and relevant. So, you don't care
against Putin. So if he did one policy for Putin, not implementing the election meddling sanctions, but he did the 5 other ones I listed that were against, I don't think you can reasonably conclude he's his puppet.
No, Kyle, that's crazy talk. So, all right, I shouldn't say that. Okay,
yeah, that's not anywhere near crazy. That's accurate.
No, first of all, you think they changed, for example, the Republican policy, and this was brought up at the time, even before we knew anything about the collusion, to say that they changed our policy, the Republican policy on Ukraine. That was real. They changed it. Now, because Trump doesn't have the political force to be able to do it when he's president, doesn't mean he's not trying to do it. So, can he unilaterally roll back NATO and say, okay, I'm kicking Estonia and Latvia, et cetera, out? Of course not. Of course not. So if you say, oh, well, he still has troops on Russia's border, that has nothing to do with Trump. He couldn't possibly change that even if he wanted to and made it his top effort. So on the issue of the Syria and the bombings, like I told you, those are totally nonsense, fake bombings. And
I don't agree, by the way.
Oh, really? Ahead. Come on, man.
No,
the new planes are sitting there and they don't bomb them, and they bomb the old planes that are already broken down. That's look at me, Daddy. I am against Putin and Assad.
No. But that's not the only time they bombed the Syrian government. There were 4 or 5 occasions where they bombed the Syrian government. Even in the midst of them fighting ISIS one time they did it. So that's not anything to scoff at. They're on the wrong side, and they're in the process of being on the wrong side, they're escalating with Putin. And that's another one of my concerns, is that as we keep pushing towards a further escalation, the Democrats are resisting from the right, not from the left. And like, for example,
that's deeply troubling, and I agree with that.
Well, let me give you one more example, because I think this one really paints a stark picture. So the other day, there was a story about how a Russian jet flew 5 feet away from a U.S. jet. And you didn't hear anything in the media and nothing from the Democrats. Now, if the Democrats really wanted to resist, here's how you resist on that. You go, oh my goodness, we almost got into a confrontation with Russia. What is Trump doing? Why is he being so reckless? What we need him to do is get out of there. What are our planes doing on the Black Sea by Russia's border? Why are we there? Get him out of there, because we can't say Trump is a thin-skinned dictator, buffoon, madman with a terrible temper, and oh yeah, isn't it the better thing to do to fly U.S. planes near Russia's border and put NATO on the border? I think if you believe he's a crazy person, which I do, then you should be screaming at him and resisting from the left. Say, get the troops out of there, get the planes out of there. I don't want to accidentally start a conflict with Russia. And again, my point is the Democrats are not making that argument. They didn't even mention that at all because they're resisting from the right. Every time they resist Trump on Russia, they're saying, well, I don't know why you're not putting more troops on NATO's border. Maybe you're Putin's puppet. And that's a problem.
I, of course, am not in that camp. We're both deeply progressive. So, I think that that conflict is totally unnecessary. I think the Democrats, I'll go further, on the issue of the FISA warrants. Now they're in a position where they're the establishment and they're fighting for FISA court to do more spying on Americans. And so do I think the surveillance of Carter Page was justified? Yes. Do I think they should do warrantless surveillance of American citizens? No. And yes, the Adam Schiffs of the world, et cetera, are now pushing from the right, and it's gross. But I think that they could be wrong. And by the way, let me further agree with you on the politics of it. I mean, Elizabeth Warren was on the show. Now, to be fair to her, it was really a while back at this point. But, but she said the number one issue in the 2018 elections for the Democratic Party should be Russia. And I was thinking, no, that's a terrible idea. Terrible politics on that. So for me, I think they should do the Russia investigation, even though it might be bad politics and even bad policy in terms of pressuring, so-called pressuring Trump to go in the wrong direction. They should do it because we need to find out if the president is working for us or working for a different country. That's monumentally important. So I can't say, well, I kind of like some of his policies in that regard. So, right? No, not
But then you're abandoning the money laundering thing you said, though, because originally you said, well, look, this is really just about money laundering. But now you just said, like, no, we need to keep investigating to see if he's working for a foreign country. Now, when I hear that, I think that's really goofy, and that's not what's happening. He's not Putin's puppet. Like,
no, definitely we have, like, the heart of the disagreement.
Yeah,
so,
I think he did money laundering. You think he's a puppet to Vladimir Putin.
No, I think he did money laundering, and hence he's a puppet to Vladimir Putin. So to go back to the conversation we were having about what's important and not important in the range. So the so-called stolen emails, anyone could have gotten those emails. Any media organization could have published those emails. I think it was, in fact, the Russians who got it, or maybe it was the Russians and someone else. But I don't think that's a thing that, to your point about what's the end game here, that's not a thing that you take a president down over. I mean, if Hillary Clinton had gotten access to Trump's emails from whatever source and used it during the campaign, nobody would have said a peep, if you ask me. So even if they think that that's a huge deal, they'll never impeach him over that. That is not enough. I think obstruction of justice is the middle ground, and I don't know if that's impeachable because, then it depends. It depends on how bad it is. And we can see with our own eyes it's pretty bad. He's firing everyone who's investigating him. So I don't know how that one gets resolved. To me, money laundering is on the other end of the scale. Really, really bad. And we got to get him the hell out of office because he's a lifelong criminal. And one of the criminal deals that he made, if we're right about that, and hence the need for the investigation, is a deal with Russian oligarchs who all work for Vladimir Putin. And they're not interested in, oh, well, we had a deal with Donald and he has all of our money, all this money of ours. But we don't want to ask for anything in return. We're Russian oligarchs. Of course, they ask for something in return.
No, this is definitely the crux of our disagreement because, listen, what I would say is, even after hearing all that, I still don't for the life of me understand why what wouldn't be put front and center is the collusion that Trump did with a foreign government, which led to weapons being sold to them and a genocide being carried out with those weapons. Because even if I grant you everything you just said, we already have all the evidence on the table for an even worse case of collusion. But again, there's a reason why that's not the issue being brought up. And the issue being brought up is the Russia issue, because look, the deep state and all of the politicians don't care that we did Israel's bidding and there were corrupt deals in the process done to try to get other countries to not care about illegal settlements under international law. That's a giant scandal. And they don't care that our weapons are currently funding a genocide in Yemen. They don't care because they're our allies, so we look the other way. And even though there's an even clearer example of a corrupt deal and Trump doing the bidding of those governments, it doesn't even register. But the final thing, Cenk, that I wanted to talk about, we didn't even really get to it yet, is the effect that this is having on the media, because I think that that's probably one of the biggest issues here. So just to give a few examples, Maddow, I already said this before, but she just flat out called for more NATO troops to be on Russia's border. The Intercept actually did a study of Maddow's show over like a time period that was, I think, a little over a month. And they found that 53% of all Maddow segments were about Russia. Every other issue combined was less than that. Then there was a FAIR study, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. They do some great work. And they looked at MSNBC coverage, and they found that MSNBC covered Russia more in one day than Yemen, the issue of the genocide in Yemen, all year. Russia got more coverage in one day than Yemen all year. 5,000% more coverage. And listen, the point that very few people know about, because this isn't really reported on at all, but you know about it and other, progressive hosts know about it, is this is having a chilling effect on us. Because, for example, YouTube just decided we're going to label all outlets that are funded by foreign governments. And the idea is they're trying to scare people off of looking at certain outlets. So for like Tom Hartman works for RT, Ed Schultz works for RT. These are people who are not Vladimir Putin's mouthpieces, but they work for RT. And now there's a warning banner across the screen. Look at the effect this is having. Like, for example, ever since they say, hey, Russian fake news affected the election in a negative way, we really need to take action on this. They changed the algorithms. Google and YouTube changed the algorithms, and now they deprioritize all independent creators, and they put an onus on outlets that are established outlets, corporate outlets, CNN, MSNBC, and all those kinds of outlets. And the reality is, Cenk, those outlets, I would argue, spread fake news a hell of a lot more than I ever did. And, I'm talking about stuff like they referred to George W. Bush doing torture as enhanced interrogation because the administration wanted them to refer to it like that. They all, were beating the war drum to go to Iraq. So, but they never get punished. Establishment outlets would never get punished for doing fake news. But outlets that are independent outlets that don't do fake news are now deprioritized in the algorithms, and this is crushing left-wing media. So Alternet, for example, Cenk, they had a cut of, I think it was like 60% drop in their traffic. And this has happened with Truth Out. This happened with Truth Dig. And basically the idea is they're taking the fact that fake news exists and they're going, okay, now we're now going to use this to crack down on all dissenting voices and independent media outlets. And it's a very convenient argument for the establishment to make to suit their ends. And look, the problem with that is, at the end of the day, I don't know what else to call that but McCarthyism and a Red Scare, because they're using the Russia issue to silence all dissent from independent media and just try to tamper our voices down.
So on that front, again, I agree with you and we agree on policy. So are they using it for bad purpose? Yes. I mean, some of the stuff on RT propaganda for the Russians? Yes. Is Tom Hartman's program propaganda? No. No, it's not. But you get the banner either way. Well, you could call Al Jazeera propaganda because they're run by the government of Qatar, and they're not going to say anything bad about Qatar. On the other hand, they do good news in other realms and cover things that the American government doesn't want you to see, right? And BBC, you could label them propaganda. They're owned by the British government, right? But we don't call them propaganda. And does the BBC constantly tear into British imperialism, et cetera? No, they tweak it. Mick resistance, if you will, right? CNN is owned by giant multinational corporations that have their own agenda. I could argue that's propaganda for Time Warner. I could argue that MSNBC is propaganda for Comcast, which has a more direct effect on our policy issues than maybe even our government, right? Or someone else's government, the Venezuelan government, et cetera. So I totally agree with you on that. And I think that there is fear-mongering going around. And by the way, they also wanted to beat up on Facebook and Google, the traditional television stations and networks. This allowed them to beat up on Facebook and Google. Do I think Pence is a dangerous guy? And is it a big win if Pence is president? Yes, I think he's dangerous. No, I don't think it's a big win if Pence is president. But I don't want to make the same mistake as the other side and say, since I don't agree with those policy positions, I'm going to look the other way. So they say, well, I like Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen, so I'm going to look the other way from Trump's corruption on Saudi Arabia. I don't want to do likewise. So I don't like that they're cracking down on independent media. No one's more affected by that than we are. But because of that, I don't want to look the other way from Trump's corruption on Russia, which I think is enormously real. And which, if you believe money laundering, you think is enormously real. I mean, money laundering is a massive crime. And there's a reason why you do that. There's another end to it. So if our president did money laundering with a foreign country, shouldn't we arrest them?
Yeah, so I support what Mueller's doing, and here's my prediction. I think he's gonna knocked out Flynn, knocked out Manafort. He's probably got some tricks up his sleeve, but Cenk, my point is, at the end of the day, you're never going to hear Mueller's getting Trump on treason, Mueller's getting some sort of crime like that.
Treason's a loaded word. You could dismiss it. Look, I might get worked up one day and say, well, that sounds like treason. But in terms of convicting him on treason, I agree with you. But convicting him on money laundering is plenty. And by the way, if in return
they have to impeach him, right? They can't indict him, can he?
He promised Russia certain policy positions. Well, that's as close to treason as it gets.
Again, I think there's already proof he did that with Israel and Saudi Arabia. So we have all the evidence we need, but they're not going down that path. They want to try to prove the harder case to prove on Russia. But my question to you is, isn't it they would have to impeach, right? Isn't it there an open legal question as to whether or not you can indict a sitting president?
Yeah, so I believe that impeachment is possible under certain circumstances. If the crimes are significant enough, hence the so-called stolen emails ain't going to do it. There's no way the Republicans are going to impeach over that. And I think Mueller would be too embarrassed to bring that case up because it's, in my opinion, relatively minor. But if you're talking about money laundering of hundreds of millions of dollars, that's a massive case. And then the poll numbers of the Republicans start to slip back down to where they were about a month ago, minus 14 to the Democrats. And then all of a sudden, the Republicans will find some principle that they had forgotten they had. And yes, impeach him if that's the fact scenario.
Yeah, I don't know how it would play out in the minds of the American people if I actually think there's a more likely chance, not the scenario you gave, but Trump fires Mueller and then that leads to potential impeachment. I think that's more likely than the scenario that we were just talking, like he gets him on some sort of grand crime and then they move to impeach. Yeah, I just don't know.
And
even
Kyle,
if all that were to unfold, just one second. Even if all that were to unfold, I don't know politically if that. I think that might actually hurt the Democrats, believe it or not.
No,
because
I don't think so.
I mean, okay, if you say so, but I just people care about putting food on the table and paying their light bill and focusing on stuff like that. So even if I were to agree with you on all the substance, like I said before, I don't know if the politics of it are going to line up. But Cenk, I hear you. Like Trump is a terrible guy. I know, I understand that you're doing it for principled reasons. And my point is, listen, even if you want to take a principled stand, there's already so much. Like Trump already violated the emoluments clause on day one of his campaign, Cenk. Like the guy, he does business in 12 different countries. okay? He takes money from all different foreign governments, not just Russia. And like I said, I think there's an even clearer case. He did Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey's bidding. So all that stuff is there. We already have the case for emoluments. So this stuff is a lot harder to prove in a court of law when you have to prove intent and all that other stuff. So I just think
So Kyle,
Yeah.
look, I think he did the emoluments. If we could get the establishment to agree, and that's why they got him out, great, because he also broke the law in that regard. But again, realistically, they're not going to do that, and that is deeply frustrating. So, but that doesn't mean that they also shouldn't investigate Russia. And so in terms of that investigation, look, let's just go over it real quick. All the stuff, not even all the stuff, just a quarter of the stuff that's public. Don Jr. and Eric Trump have both said, yes, we got money for the golf courses and our properties from the Russians. They admitted it themselves. One was in 2008, one was later. Eric Trump said to a Golf Magazine reporter, they said, where'd you get the money? You guys went bankrupt all these times. Where'd you get the money for the golf courses? And Eric Trump said, oh, the Russians. Apparently they really, really like golf. Okay, and there's a server in Pennsylvania, in the middle of Pennsylvania, that's Donald Trump's server. All the top cybersecurity experts in the world say it keeps getting pinged by Russia. 80% of the pings are from Russia. You know who's pinging it? Alpha Bank. They don't know what the pings are, but that ain't no coincidence.
I think that story was retracted.
Yeah, I don't know what you mean by retracted.
Well, I'll send you the article. There's an article in The Intercept which lists that among articles that have been, they said, we messed up this one. This isn't real.
I'll take a look at it. I'll read it. But last I saw, I don't see any reason. They seem to have excellent evidence. The other 18% of the pings, by the way, were coming from the DeVos family, another wild coincidence. And then we know Eric Prince, also from the DeVos family, went to Seychelles and met with the Russians and some Gulf country people in a place where they wouldn't be caught having a secret meeting. Why is Eric Prince going to have a secret meeting with the Russians? Because they don't have a deal?
Jake, I think he did money laundering. You're preaching to the choir, and I think it's even worse than what you're laying out, because I think he did money laundering for the Russian mafia, which, is arguably even worse than doing it for, I don't know, some government officials. So I think there's enough there. But again, I think where I differ from you is I think that the effects of how this is all playing out and the consequences of the hyper focus on that issue is just leaving so many stones unturned and leaving the most important arguments the Democrats should be making at the side of the road, along with the media, the same thing. And just the final thing I want to say real fast is, so there was a story, I should probably send it to you because I don't know if you saw this, because I think it was only in one outlet. I think it was the International Business Times. Nobody else picked it up. But there was a story that basically proved collusion between Donald Trump and the predatory payday lender industry, to the point where they gave him some ridiculous amount of money in a variety of different ways. They gave it to Mick Mulvaney, his head of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. They gave it to him at his inauguration. It was some ridiculous, I think it was over $1 million they gave him at his inauguration. And then they scrapped all of the rules on the predatory payday lending industry that were supposed to go into place and made it so that they're allowed to charge 950%. And again, we can trace all these lines here to show exactly how corrupt they are and exactly how much they're screwing over regular people. And my concern, Cenk, is nobody's talking about this. And this is the stuff where you hammer him and you can win an election. And I think that it's mostly blowing off steam when we talk about the Russia thing, because there's so much conspiracy mongering over it and leaps of logic that it makes the Democrats look unhinged.
Yeah, no. So look, when you say Rachel Maddow shouldn't cover Russia with 53% of her stories, I say, of course, that's wildly.
I would hope, yes.
Yeah, that's wildly disproportionate and preposterous, right? But when you say conspiracy theories regarding Russia, that's where you lose me, and that's where I get frustrated.
But
they're
right
out in the open.
Examples.
Why has he fired everyone investigating him? Because he did it.
No, Cenk, but you're disregarding the fact that there are like 6 or 7 different stories that have officially been retracted. Those are the conspiracies I'm talking about. The conspiracy mongers who jump to conclusions and then they have to retract the story a week and a half later. So that's what I'm referring to. And you've seen those articles. I'm sure you have.
And Kyle, the story you referenced was unfortunately in this insanely corrupted system that we have, run-of-the-mill corruption. And the establishment is never going to convict them on that or go after them on that because they all do the same thing. They take contributions and then give their donors exactly what they want.
That's the problem. So
I agree. But that doesn't, but like that's what's driving me crazy though, Kyle, which is that like we agree on all that stuff, but that doesn't mean and we should let Russia go.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying you want to get him on money laundering. You want to do the investigation. I just told you 1,000 times. I support what Robert Mueller's doing. But my whole point, Cenk, my whole argument is everybody needs to pump their brakes a little bit if you're on the Democratic side, because there's a lot of overreaching going on this issue. And not only that, but there's also a lot of downsides to over-focusing on it, like the 1,000 I just mentioned, the effect on media, and all that other stuff, weak arguments of the Democrats, so on and so forth. So I think at the end of the day, our agreement will remain simply on money laundering. But the effects of all this and everything outside of that, I don't think that we're going to see eye to eye on that.
So we're at an end, and I think we accomplished our mission. We found out what we agree and disagree on, and unsurprisingly, we actually agree on a huge majority of the things that we discussed. And I think that it is just largely a matter of emphasis as to as to those issues. And I don't agree with mainstream media and their obsessive, nonstop, exclusive coverage of Russia, exclusive of anything else. And I agree totally it's in avoidance of real issues. But I believe we can do real issues and talk about his corruption at the same time. And yes, his corruption is terrible and legion on many fronts, but also on Russia. And I think that if a president did money laundering, that's a massive crime. And especially if he promised the other side something in return, like, for example, not enforcing sanctions that have been the force of law, well, that's as bad as it gets. And Godspeed to Robert Mueller.
Sounds good.
All right, we did it. Okay. Kyle, thanks for joining us. Excellent conversation. Everybody check out Secular Talk. And don't let anybody tell you that that the establishment media is any better than independent media. I think that you're going to get way closer to the truth and the facts of all these different issues if you watch Kyle's show than if you watched anything on cable news. If you like this interview and you're at the end, so apparently you liked it a little bit, thank you for watching. We really appreciate it. You can watch them live as they happen if you're a member. Only members get that. Go to tytnetwork.com/join and you get not only interviews live, you get the Young Turks live, you get Aggressive Progressive live, Old School, and all of it commercial free. Come join us right now. tytnetwork.com/join.